It is an honor to be here. Where are my lunch peeps who sat at the table with me? Yes, represent. That was cool. We had some good conversation. I'm excited to be with all of you. This is a topic that I really enjoy speaking about because I think it applies to every one of us in the room, regardless of what you do. And it probably applies to you as a user and as a consumer. And so hopefully you'll get something that you'll be able to take away from this event. This is my son, Everest. He's a lot like any kid his age. He loves recording himself doing stuff. In this particular one, he was recording himself in his bedroom. Didn't go so well, of course. So I said to Everest, not right after this, but later, I said, Everest, let's go grab your brothers. We're going to go to Five Guys. That wasn't a hard sell. They enjoyed doing that. But I said, we're going to do something different this time, and that is I'm going to take my camera with me. And they had no idea what I was about to do, but what the idea was to take them to Five Guys, and I wanted Everest, you'll see his hand in just a second, I wanted to record him using this soda machine. Now, you've used one of these things dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times, right? You know how it works. You put your cup underneath, you push the button, and the liquid comes out underneath. We've seen this so many times. It's very familiar to all of us. We bought a home. I'm in Sarasota, Florida. We bought a home a few years ago. The home was built in 1986. Most of the home was still in 1986 when we bought it. And so we've systematically been going through trying to bring it into the 2000s. And one of the things that we had to replace was the fridge. And this is the fridge we bought. This is an LG fridge. This is what the water dispenser looks like. When people come over to use this fridge, it is a game, literally, that we play with these people. Because they take that knowledge of the soda machine and bring it to this fridge, and this is how it works. This is not an exaggeration. I had two of my friends over who had never been in our house just 2 weeks prior to this event, and we were 2 for 2. Both of them used the fridge exactly like this. And so there have been times where we've stood by and we said, go ahead and try it. And we've had a towel ready because we know how it's going to play out. We'll call this mental models, call it intuition, call it muscle memory, but the fact is we take our experience with that soda machine and we transfer it to this, and we expect it to work one way, and it doesn't, right? It's a new experience, and it doesn't work the way we expect it to, and that's kind of the theme of what we'll talk about today. But you've seen this before as a user. If you've had, here's another example. So you've had an icon on your home screen for a long time, right? And you move that icon somewhere else. What happens almost immediately after that? A lot of us probably tap where that icon, I do at least, tap where that icon used to be, right? It's muscle memory. It's things kicking in where you're used to that functioning and looking a certain way, and it doesn't. This is the dapper Mr. Kevin Spacey. I'm going to let him introduce my remarks today. His show, House of Cards, appeared on Netflix in 2013. And you're going to see him speaking at the Edinburgh International TV Festival, and he's going to talk about platform labels and how we've used these things for decades, and they may not apply to where things are at now.
So I predict that in the next decade or two, any differentiation between these platforms will fall away. Is 13 hours watched as one cinematic whole really any different than a film? Do we define film as being something 2 hours or less? Surely it goes deeper than that. If you're watching a film on your television, is it no longer a film because you're not watching it in a theater? If you watch a TV show on your iPad, is it no longer a TV show? The device and the length are irrelevant. The labels are useless, except perhaps to agents and managers and lawyers who use these labels to conduct business deals. But for kids growing up now, there's no difference. Watching Avatar on an iPad or watching YouTube on a TV or watching Game of Thrones on their computer. It's all content. It's just story. And the audience has spoken. They want stories. They're dying for them. They're rooting for us to give them the right thing. And they will talk about it, binge on it, carry it with them on the bus and to the hairdresser, force it on their friends, tweet, blog, Facebook, make fan pages, silly GIFs, and God knows what else about it. Engage with it with a passion and an intimacy that a blockbuster movie could only dream of. And all we have to do is give it to them.
Yeah, as if it were that easy, right? But that's why we're at events like this, to learn how to be able to do that. Who knew that Kevin Spacey knew that much about our industry? That's a pretty impressive speech. It goes on for about 45 minutes, I think. So this is what he's talking about, right? This is what we've been accustomed to. We talk about, well, for decades at least, talking about TV and phone and these very distinct entities. Nowadays it's this, right? We have a TV and a phone, but what exactly does TV mean? Are we talking about the device or kind of the nostalgic act of watching TV? When I wrote Mobile Web Design in 2007, it was a different world that existed back then as far as mobile devices, and it was very challenging to write about mobile web design because it just didn't exist. And so I was trying to parse out what could we be doing and what could we be expecting down the road. This is kind of what existed back then, right? We had computer and phone, and even nowadays, how do we draw the distinction between those two? Funny thing happened as I was wrapping up the book and I was talking about how do we go about producing web experiences. Someone said to me, have you heard about media queries? Media queries were not a thing back then, at least they were not widely used or supported. And I looked into it a bit and I said, you know, I can't really do a whole lot with that right now, and here we are, of course, 8 years later in a very different world. However, I think we're falling still into the same trap that Kevin Spacey described. And this is what our world looks like today, right? 6 years ago, we were comfortable with saying, well, this is mobile and this is tablet. And we drew these nice lines between the two. And now, we can't do that, right? I mean, we have different screen sizes, and what exactly is mobile? What exactly is tablet? How do we draw lines between all of these things? And what about watch and wearables and all of that? That's a different world, and how do we parse through that? We've kind of also grown accustomed to talking about desktop, tablet, and mobile, haven't we? And we talk about these things as if we can put them in these nice silos and say, well, on the desktop we have unlimited data, but on mobile we have limited data, and so on and so forth. When in reality, this is more like what we have. We have a variety of screen sizes, and these things might span the entire gamut of every one of those screens where we're dealing with limited data. So when I'm on my personal hotspot traveling, connected to my laptop, data becomes an issue. I no longer have unlimited data with that large screen. My goal for this presentation is to convince you of this, that the best interface is the one within reach. And I'll hopefully share some thoughts that reinforce this idea as we go along. Just to back up a little bit, tell you a little bit more about myself. As Jeffrey mentioned, I've been running Authentic Jobs now for 10 years. We have a sister site called Authentic Pros. You might see a little card for it in the bags that they gave you. I've dabbled in print design. I was telling some of the people at the lunch table, I've done a few posters like this where I reimagine buildings as if designed entirely with type. This is the Brooklyn Bridge. This is some of the wires and the arches, and when they're done, they look like this. If you notice, I think you can see it. Yeah. Notice anything about this word right here? Yeah, it's misspelled. This was a Kickstarter project. We raised about $64,000. I say we, it was just me. And Christmas Eve, we had shipped out about 400 of these posters or something like that. And I got an email Christmas Eve from one of the persons who had received theirs saying, you know, Cameron, my poster looks great, but I noticed Brooklyn was misspelled. Is that just my poster? And unfortunately, it was not. And so I set all this aside Christmas Day, but for the rest of Christmas break, I spent a lot of time trying to correct this issue. And I don't have time to go into it now, but it actually turned out to be a good experience to know how to correct a situation like this. So I've done 3 of these: the Brooklyn Bridge, the Salt Lake Temple, and the Colosseum in Rome. I don't know if I'll be stupid enough to do more of them because they are just crazy, crazy work. This one took about 300 hours from start to finish, and it's suicidal. And then we just launched a project on the side, totally unrelated to Authentic Jobs, called Spoken, We like to think of this as the Instagram of audio. It's still in private beta, but basically it's a community focused around spoken recordings, the spoken word. With the difference, a lot of people ask us, well, don't we have podcasting for that? Well, absolutely, but with spoken, you have 3 minutes. You got to say what you're going to say in 3 minutes, and that's it. It really is kind of like an Instagram of audio. This is one of the pieces. I won't play the whole piece for you. I'll play just about 30 seconds of it. But the reason I mention this is I wish I could show more. I can't yet, but maybe at some point I'll be able to talk about this. We are wrestling with the very things that I'm talking about in this presentation, or will be talking about, where we're trying to dissect how do we make a unified experience when you talk about big screens and small screens and the app that we're building, and how does all of that play together, and what happens if they go from the desktop to the mobile, and so on and so forth. How do we wrestle with that? Well, when I gave this presentation in Washington, D.C. a couple months ago, I went to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and captured some audio and decided to post it to spoken. Here's just a snippet of that from D.C.
The sounds you're hearing are at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. It's also known as the Tomb of the Unknowns, as the remains of 3 soldiers lie in rest at the monument.
That was an excuse to fix my mic. I don't know if you saw that or not, but that's why we played that. So that's kind of a general idea of what those pieces sound like. Some are very, I guess, more edited like that piece, and some are very informal with an iPhone mic and so forth. But at some point, I hope to talk about some of the things that we're challenged by in terms of trying to make this a unified experience. I have 5 sons. You saw Everest there on the left. This is another word of caution. If you have young children, do not show them how to use the clone stamp tool. I gave them this photo, and they did that, and here's what they did with our family photo. Yeah, so don't do that. So, responsive web design. I'm actually not really going to talk about this, but I think I can't proceed without recognizing the impact it's had on our industry. You don't need me to talk about this. You have Ethan Marcotte here, you have Karen, you have all these other people who know so much more than I do about this. And I think at this point, most of us recognize the impact that it has had on us. I think this research from Opera underscores the importance of responsive design. You have Africa and Asia, 2 of the fastest growing mobile markets, and they hardly use apps. If you see that grid on the top, for example, 4% of users use apps, generally speaking. 96% use the web. And so responsive design, adapting to whatever the device is that they have, is pretty important. I was in Ethiopia 3 years ago. I was astounded to see how many people had smartphones in Ethiopia. You think, well, they've got feature phones, right? The archaic Nokias and so forth. That is not the case. There are people, certainly in Africa and other places, that have some of the same devices that we have here in the States, and yet they use it very differently, right? In the States, you look on the bottom, we're heavily skewed toward apps. That doesn't always work out too well. And here's Greg Hoy saying, the CNN iOS app is so bad, I took the unprecedented steps of deleting it and reinstalling it just so I could delete it again. Now, that was 2 years ago. If anyone from the CNN team is here, I think you're doing a terrific job. I'm sure he would say the same today. Just to poke fun a little bit more, though, if I can do that tenderly, because I think it's fair. I'll poke fun at myself here in just a little bit, too. I installed the CNN app just a couple weeks ago because I hadn't seen it in a long time. And so I'm like, okay, I get the app on my phone, and once I got through, there's like a series of screens I had to dismiss to be able to get to the actual start of the app itself, right? In terms of changed and blah, blah, blah. And then I get to this screen. It says, gives me the option to play This is CNN when the application launches. I'm like, no, you got to be kidding me. And sure enough,
this is CNN.
And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to try this out. So I open the app, and I close it. I'm like, this is not for reals. It doesn't really do this every time I launch the app, does it?
This is CNN.
Yes. I totally want James Earl Jones to say that every time it opens. I have to chuckle a little bit because this is probably, at least in my experience, this is probably something that comes from way high up in management, and they're like, it must say this is CNN when it opens. I tweeted about this, and someone came back who I guess had the app for a while and said, yeah, well, at least it's an option now. It wasn't always an option. Well, at any rate, I think we know that the web is not restricted to an app. It's not restricted to a browser on the desktop. We get that at this point. We totally understand that. Here's an example of this. 49% of multi-screen users email themselves a link for continuing an activity on another device. I do this all the time. Am I the only one? Does anyone else ever do this? Okay, that gives me some good encouragement. I do this all the time where I'm reading something on my iPad or phone, and then I'll continue that later by emailing it to myself. I'm astounded that if this is the case, and if as many of you raised your hands, that of all the apps on my phone, dozens of apps on my phone, only one of them recognizes this. It's called JotNot, and you basically take a photograph of a document to send as if you were faxing, something archaic like that. And it has this nifty little feature that says email to myself. And you configure this in just one tap. You basically email that document. And 99% of the time I open this app, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm emailing this to myself. And then from there, I'll compose an email and send it on to someone else. Now, in this next screen, please ignore the fact that my phone calls me Pumpkin. There's a bit of a story behind that. This got stuck in a presentation. I didn't realize it till later, so I just decided to leave it in there. But I found this extension that you can install, at least for iOS. There might be something similar for Android. I don't know how it functions there, but it's called Mail to Self. And once you put this in there, you now have an option within Safari and within a lot of other apps to just tap that and replicate what you saw in JotNot within many other apps on at least iOS. Now, if we celebrate responsive design's strengths and weaknesses, I think it's fair to also acknowledge its shortcomings and how we can address those shortcomings. And one of these shortcomings that I think a lot of us I certainly do, fall into the trap of doing is to make assumptions for the user about how content should be presented to them. We have this notion of, fixed width is dead and there's no longer just one screen size and so forth. But to an extent, we're still kind of making those same mistakes of deciding what the user sees at what screen size. Here's an example of this. Ask yourself this question. Does my site's responsive mobile version disable pinch and zoom? Or better yet, go check it out. Go check your company website, your personal website, and see if pinch and zoom is disabled. I would imagine for most of us that is the case. For Authentic Jobs, you cannot pinch and zoom once you get onto the mobile Safari version of Authentic Jobs, for example. And I was reminded of this when someone emailed me asking if they wanted me to sponsor a conference. And so I saw the email on my phone, I tapped the link to go to the sponsorship prices, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't scroll horizontally, I couldn't pinch and zoom to be able to get to that table. Now, I wouldn't fault them for a minor snafu like this, but I might fault maybe our general approach to responsive design leading to things like this happening, where no one's forgotten how to pinch and zoom, but sometimes we think that they don't need to. And I think that's in part because we've served them the best possible display of their content. So many of us, another example, if not all of us, have approached the responsiveness of our designs on mobile smaller screens like this, right? It's a single column, linear content. And then you have things like Pinterest, where on the desktop you get this rich, dense content experience. And on mobile, you get a single column Instagram-like experience, which is fine if you're on Instagram, but go back to that soda machine versus fridge model for a second. What if your experience coming from desktop brings with it the expectation that Pinterest is going to look or function differently than you're seeing here in that small snippet, right? That you might take with you the expectation that you're going to be able to see a rich, dense content layout even on a smaller screen. Well, I think it's fine to consider what you just saw there with the smaller screen linear layouts if the task for our users is to focus and to concentrate, like reading. Totally appropriate. But what if the primary task is instead scanning and wayfinding and understanding context of where you're at? How does that work out? And how does a linear single column layout cater to that, or does it not? Now, I hadn't looked at Pinterest in a while. The first time I'd created these slides was a while ago. And I looked just a couple weeks ago, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that if you pull it up on mobile, it looks like this now. I think they're recognizing that people want maybe something a bit more dense than you saw in that first screen from about a year ago. So I've started wondering, what if we gave the users a more elective experience, and we empowered them to decide for themselves what our content looked like on their mobile devices? And I started asking the question, what if you could use media queries? What if you could use pinch and zoom to be able to refactor the content? So instead of something like this, we could instead allow users to pinch and zoom to where they saw something with 2 columns or 3 columns. I tweeted about this a while ago, and someone by the name of Aaron Pinero took this idea and created a proof of concept using media queries. It's not really feasible to do this right now, but you can see what he's doing here. This is not zooming as we know it, where the canvas goes off screen and we're like zooming in with a magnifying glass. This is where the content is actually refactoring as you pinch and zoom. He's doing it with a laptop, but the idea is basically that. What if someone pulled up Pinterest on their phone and it was a single column and they could just pinch to refactor that to get 3 columns or whatever they ended up choosing? This doesn't exist today, right? I mean, this is probably a few years down the road, if it ever even happens. But I hope that we continue to explore giving some of that control back to our users instead of deciding for them what we think is the best presentation of our content on their device. Here is another shortcoming, and it is this. I think responsive, well, I don't think. We know that responsive design ends where the browser ends. And so if our rally cry is to make everything work everywhere, then we need something that builds on responsive design, incorporates the spirit of responsive design, but unifies all of the touch points. So if they leave the browser and go to an app or something like that, whether on single device, multiple devices, whatever, they can have a unified experience. Responsive design provides a wonderful unified experience, but as soon as they go outside the browser, what decisions have we made inside our apps and so forth? And I'll show some examples of good apps and not so great apps that could improve in this area. One more example, actually, before we do that. For those of you that use Facebook beyond the desktop, I'm going to ask you if you use on your smartphone, let's say, do you access Facebook through the Facebook app, or do you do it through a browser on your smartphone? Raise your hand if you access Facebook through a browser on your smartphone. Raise your hands if you use the Facebook app. Yeah, that's pretty indicative of what most people do with Facebook. Not even just the tech crowd, right? My mother, not as tech savvy, app user, and so on and so forth. And we've seen some of the stats that demonstrate that. And so as just a general example, if we put all of our eggs in the responsive basket, and we say that's all we need to do to make it work everywhere, then what happens when they leave that experience? What happens when most of the people in this room are using our app and not the browser? How does that experience reflect what they get on the desktop? How do they go from the soda machine on the desktop to the fridge on the mobile device and bring those expectations with them? So if we go back to this chart, if our audience is comprised of mobile app users versus the site, then of course we have to begin thinking beyond that. I appreciate what John Donahoe has said about this topic. He was the CEO of eBay. I think he might be the CEO of PayPal now. He was in an interview with Charlie Rose, and he said this. He says, we understood mobile just to be another screen. He was saying that it's just another way to interact with their service. Contrast that statement with a study from Google a couple of years ago. It was a great study. In fact, the 49% that I mentioned about emailing themselves, I think, came from that study. But it was interesting, a few pages in, where they start defining smartphones and tablets and desktop. And this is what they said. They said with smartphone, this is typically how you would use an experience on the smartphone. It's on the go, communicate short bursts of time, and so forth. Well, later in that interview with Charlie Rose, John Donahoe says, he stops him, he says, Charlie, look, we are selling 8,000 cars a week through mobile experiences. Does that jive with what we expect this silo of mobile to be, where it's a short burst? And talk about buying a car through a mobile experience. That's a very different approach than what you're seeing here, which is often how we kind of silo things and say, well, this deserves a different treatment. I think it's fair to step back for just a moment and say, what are we talking about when we say mobile anyways? Are we talking about the noun or the verb? Are we talking about the device, or are we talking about the act of being mobile? How about the device first? This is the Galaxy Note 8. This is either the world's largest phone or a tablet that also functions as a phone. This slide was funnier before iPhone 6 Plus came out, and now we're like, are we okay with anything being as big as this? This is the, get ready for it, this is the Acer DA220HQL. Is that a sexy name or what? This is a 22-inch touchscreen that runs on Android. How do we classify this thing? What silo or bucket does that fit into? How about the verb, the act of being mobile? Is this mobile? I think most of us would say yes. It looks like he's on the train. He's on a mobile device. How about this? He's sitting in the passenger seat of his car, probably on a personal hotspot. Is this mobile? Are we talking about the screen, the device, the act of being mobile? What about this? Is this mobile? Well, he's got his mobile phone out, but it looks like he's seated in the office. In that, I think it was that same study that I just bashed a little bit. They say that 77% of mobile searches happen at home or at work. And so how do we use this phrase of mobile? Do the labels, platform labels, still apply, as Kevin Spacey was saying? We understand that this whole mobile landscape has changed dramatically, right? This is the St. Peter's Square at the announcement of new Pope in 2005, and then again in 2013. And if that isn't a description of where we're at today versus a decade ago, I don't know what is. And this photo, I love this photo because it so beautifully demonstrates that this is not a United States thing, right? I mean, this is a global change that we've seen throughout the world. Well, all of this mobility, both the noun and the verb, has created this need to step back and assess how all of these encounters with content and functionality begin to come together and how they're unified. And the delightful or frustrating experiences that creates for our users. You're going to hear the voice of Farhad Manjoo. He's talking to NPR. This was prior to the announcement of iPhone 6 and Apple Watch. We kind of knew what was going to happen. He kind of knew what was going to be announced. And here he's talking about what his expectations were from Apple, generally speaking, and not necessarily just for those devices.
Yeah, the problem that I have in my life at the moment is that I use a bunch of different devices, a computer, a phone, a tablet, and there's very little kind of coordination between them. I start one activity on my computer, and then I go to my phone, and it's hard to kind of find what I was doing. Apple has begun to work on something to do that, to kind of tie in what you're doing on your computer to what you're doing on your phone. Google is doing so as well, but I think that that is sort of the next major area of innovation that I would like to see. We all are going to be using more and more devices, but so far there's no kind of great way to make moving between them kind of seamless, and I really hope that that's kind of the place that they focus their innovation on.
And Apple's made some strides in this area. One example is, here's the Apple Store update notes from about a year ago. Now start shopping on one device and finish on another, even your Mac or your PC. And with lots of other things, they've been trying to do this. I think Microsoft, to be honest, might be ahead of them in this regard. Here's the pitch on Windows 10 to developers, where they talk about one operating system, one developer platform. I saw some members of this team, where was it? I don't remember now, about 4 or 5 months ago, we were talking about this concept, and they really are trying to make it a unified experience both for users as well as the platform developers. ESPN, from their redesign last year, saying we aim to create a cohesive aesthetic and experience across the new ESPN.com and our native applications. So the question then becomes, how do we build on this? How do we take the goodness of all of this and begin applying it to trying to unify things beyond just the browser? I think one place to start is to say, what if we took the W out and we said, let's talk about responsive design in its truest form. Let's talk about responsive things beyond just the browser, beyond just the web. And I think if we start doing that, we get into this territory, and that's where I want to spend most of my focus today, this idea of unified user experiences. When I say unified, I mean, it's just basic stuff, right? I mean, this is forming a united whole. We're not talking about mindlessly cloning things from one screen to the next. The goal really is cohesion. It really is unity, a holistic user experience. We're not talking about cloning things like Southwest Airlines did in the early days of its website. This is the original iFlySWA.com. This is what the website looked like in 1996. They were trying to, maybe to their credit, replicate the offline experience of going up to a counter And if you wanted to make reservations, you had to tap on the phone in the upper left, or if you wanted to read news, you tapped the newspaper, and so forth. This is not what we're talking about, though. There's still plenty of room for the NPR ones of the world, where they take a product that looks like it may be radically different than the primary brand offering, but it's still unified in that the content is there, the expectations are there, and so forth. When I talk about unified UX, to me, there are two facets that I think are most important. Number one, form and function, with emphasis on and two, data symmetry. Let's pick apart both of these for just a second. Function over form, right? I mean, that's kind of 101 design basics, right? Well, I'm not so sure we can make that argument effectively when it comes to unifying experiences. Consider this story from Bruce Lawson. So his dad, Bruce Lawson has done a lot of things in the tech world. He gave his father an Android phone a couple Christmases ago, and watched as his dad would thumb through these websites that he was familiar with on his phone, and he had this puzzled look on his face. This is what Bruce says in his words. When a site looked radically different, he'd check the address bar to ensure that he typed in the right address. In short, he found responsive design to be confusing, and it meant that he didn't trust the site that he was on. So this lack of unified form led to this jarring experience. He was taking a soda machine experience to this brand new device, and it wasn't working the way he was expecting it to. It wasn't familiar to him. Probably the best offline example, aside from that fridge, that I could come up with is the iconic Coca-Cola contour bottle. I don't know if you know the history of how this thing came about, but in the early 1920s, Coca-Cola was facing an influx of many, many competitors. And so in defense of their brand, the company issued, heaven forbid, a design contest, basically. And there was one unique requirement for that design contest, and it was that the bottle had to be recognizable in the dark. So if you were to reach for a Coke in the dark, you would know that you were reaching for and grabbing a Coca-Cola and not one of their competitors. And so in the case of this contour bottle, it functioned just fine as a bottle, but the form was as critical to their brand and their experience as was the function of that bottle, meaning just being able to drink out of that bottle. So really, when we talk about unifying our experiences, we really have to talk about function and form together and almost being equally important. Amazon, for me, is probably the archetype of great unified user experiences. I spend probably upwards of $10,000 personal and business purchases through Amazon, and it works exactly the way I expect it to. I can pull it up on any size screen, and if I'm signed in, all of my data persists across the board. I mean, the shopping cart, the wish lists, you name it, it's all there. Gmail functions largely the same way. Visually, it's very unified. They've had these metaphors for stacked, if you go through the browser, for these stacked emails for a very long time, right? And it's not just one size screen, it's any screen. And it goes all the way back to that book I wrote, at least to 2007. This is a screenshot that's included in my book. This is a Nokia 6680, and you can see that that metaphor of those stacked messages existed 8 years ago. This is what Authentic Jobs looks like today. We're working on a very substantial redesign of Authentic Jobs, and it's actually been very challenging. Searching and filtering jobs is more complicated than it probably looks at first glance. Responsive design is generally a lot easier if it's strictly or largely content, right? So if it's a blog or a marketing site, it's typically easier to pull off responsive design. Once you start throwing in a lot of filtering and have that be real-time filtering, it becomes a lot more challenging to have the interface adapt to that. This is what the redesign, by the way, will look like, or at least roughly what it's going to look like, quite a bit different. And throughout this process, we've been looking for examples of other websites that have done this kind of complexity of searching and filtering. And one of those is MusicBed. By the way, if you ever need music for a video, this is a great resource for that. There's several ones out there. I think one of them is called Audio Boom, if I'm not mistaken. That one you can get some really cheap tracks. A lot of them are synthesized, but this typically is actual instrumental music that you can license for a video if you need to. We love this site, and we were thinking, well, gosh, if you look at that previous redesign that we're working on and this one, you have kind of the same thing going on with the sidebar navigation and some filtering going across the top. And sure, we're thinking, boy, they've they've got to have this figured out when it comes to responsive design. And so I don't remember when, but we pulled up Music Bed on our phones, and this is what we came up with. That's what you get. You either get to open the app, or get the app, or start a chat. You can't do anything else. Now, the Music Bed guys, when I talked about this in another conference, they reached out to me and said, hey, Cameron, we actually are working on a very responsive design of our site. We felt our app was working well at the time. We didn't have the resources to pour into it. We do now, and so hopefully very soon, when you pull up Music Bed, you'll see a responsive version that I hope incorporates all of that same functionality. The easiest thing for them to do would be to remove all of that filtering and remove all of that searching and just give you kind of a tap-based navigation. But that's easy. We want to go the challenging route of trying to make things actually searchable and filterable, and we're almost there, and I think they will be there as well soon. Audio, same kind of deal. If you pull up audio, you can listen to it in a browser on the desktop or a larger screen. You cannot do that on a smaller screen. Data symmetry involves, the second of these two facets, involves repetition, continuity, and synchronicity of data across screens, across devices, across platforms. Facebook commissioned a study and found that more than 40% of all online US users start an activity on one device and they finish it on another. And 2/3 of those users use multiple screens when shopping, among other things. I think there are two basic kinds of symmetry. Sequential, like you saw with Amazon, where things will persist as you proceed, and synchronous. Let me give you an example of synchronous symmetry. So this is my desktop. My iMac is connected to a pair of speakers, and those speakers provide the music for my office. So if I want music in my office, I'll pull up audio and begin playing a playlist. And I did that on this particular day. I selected a playlist. This is, you can see the Mac there. This is my office with the speakers. And down here in the lower left is a couch that I'll often sit on. And so on that given day, I started playing a playlist, went over to the couch to pull up whatever I was going to do on my MacBook. And as soon as I opened the lid, I was like, what in the world just happened? I didn't realize that I had the audio app also opened on my MacBook. And when I saw that, this thing appeared for the first time that I had not seen before down in the bottom, and it says remote control mode. Audio is playing elsewhere but can be controlled from this machine. And I was like, no, you got to be kidding me. So I tapped the pause button, and sure enough, back on my iMac, where the instance of audio was playing, it pauses the music. And I changed the playlist and so forth. I don't think this is exclusive to audio. I think Spotify does this as well. In fact, I know it does because I had some teenagers in my car not too long ago. There were two of us traveling, and there were two brothers. One was in my car, and one was in the other car. And they were both signed into Spotify, and you can guess what happened as they were kind of changing each other's playlists in the two cars, because he had it connected to the speakers in my car and so forth. And this is not done through Wi-Fi, right? This is done through the service. But this is a great example of synchronous symmetry. Here's another example of sequential symmetry. You saw the Amazon one. Let me show you another one that doesn't work as well as it should or it could. And this comes from Zappos. I love Zappos. This is an example from about a year and a half ago, and they've changed it since. It's much better now. But I'll use this as an example of how not to do this kind of thing. If you have an item, back then, if you had an item in your cart, and I was signed in, as you can see here, I have two items in my cart, that does not carry over to any other screen. So here I'm signed in to my account on another device, and you can see that my shopping cart is empty. That's because they're simply storing that data as a session, as a cookie on that particular device. Well, as I was working on this presentation, months ago, an earlier version of it, there happened to be an email that came in from Zappos, and I was actually in the process of talking about Zappos or writing some notes about it. And I took the bait, so I said, okay, I'll see where this is going to go. I tapped proceed to cart, and of course I couldn't get there without seeing this interstitial screen. I said, no, thank you. And when I got there, there was nothing in there. But you saw that email said, you have two items in your cart. Go check these out. Go purchase these items. And when I got there, they simply were not present in my cart, even though I was signed in. This is kind of like that. Again, our soda machine versus fridge example. By the way, if you want to browse the mobile web, this is how you have to do it. Navigate to the site, close the modal pop-up, decline the native app offer, close the top, bottom banners, and then you're finally on your way. I'm sure you've never seen that before. Today, things are much more unified with Zappos. Account data is shared across screens. Visually, they're not quite there yet, right? So here's the app on the left. Here on the right is what it looks like through the browser. They don't have to be identical. But again, if someone jumps from one to the other, what happens? And you might say, well, Cameron, wouldn't they just exclusively use the app and never go through the browser on their phone? Well, let's go back to the example I just showed you, where I was on my phone, and I have the app installed, but it, of course, took me over to the web version of Zappos. And it was very different aesthetically, but it certainly didn't have my data in the cart. In comparison, Amazon not only excels at data symmetry, but the visuals, as you can see, are very cohesive with the app on the left and the browser on the right. So as we start to wrap things up, I want to take a look at some, what I think are becoming, I don't think we're there yet to say these are the best practices, maybe we are, but I think these are some that I've seen emerging as I've talked about this, as I've experienced this as a user and as a developer designer. And I think these are possibly some ideas for, yes, creating unified user experiences to begin with, but also fostering a mindset of unity amongst our teams, which is equally important. We have to get people on the same page talking about this if we're going to be successful presenting this to users. Number one, make your product accessible via internet, not just the web. Now, this might sound a little strange, but if you think about it, when you use an app on your phone, you're using the internet, but you may not necessarily be using the web semantically speaking, right? Web generally involves HTTP protocol, often a browser, but not necessarily the internet. Again, this might be a semantics debate, but the point here is that if we're going to begin thinking about unified user experiences and responsive design in its truest sense, then we have to move beyond just the browser to be able to do that. Here's an example of this. Of the 5 products in Apple's navigation, 2 of them do not have a browser installed. And so how does your product work when it encounters that kind of an experience? Some of you might have all 5 of these devices. Some of you might even traverse all 5 of those devices with the same product or app. And what is that experience like? How unified is that experience as you go across? We've talked about this for a long time, which is also another wonderful thing. But maybe now it's time to move beyond just mobile first and say we need to think maybe about Unity first, but start with mobile. Inventory and then unify as many elements as possible throughout the entire user experience. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about things like copy, tone, typography, iconography, imagery, flow, account data, and so on and so forth. Facebook, actually I'll come back to that in just a second. Let me share a good example of this. MailChimp does a great job. Anywhere I go within the MailChimp experience, doesn't matter what touch point it is, it's very unified in their tone, right? So they have kind of a very casual demeanor about their brand, like Bro Freddy. Same with Slack, a very casual demeanor to their brand. And I know that this is MailChimp. And you might argue, well, that's branding, isn't it? Well, yeah, yes, it is. Branding is the original source of unity for consumers, isn't it? And so I think there are things we can learn from that. Meaning that if we're working on style tiles and style guides and pattern libraries and all these things, if they are approached in this mindset of unity, then we start on day one and at step one thinking about these kinds of things. Consider, and the key word here is consider. I'll come back to this in just a second. But consider using web views when developing your native app. Luke Mathis wrote a brief but terrific article where he compared web apps and native apps. And in it, he says, you're already using web apps in native wrappers without even noticing it. The fact that nobody even notices, the fact that this isn't a story, shows that when it comes to user experience, web versus native doesn't matter anymore. So with web views, it essentially allows you to display HTML content inside a wrapper. So your native app might render the navigation bar, for example, as part of the app, but then everything else is rendered with HTML, with web views. I haven't been able to confirm, but I'm pretty sure that Amazon is using web views for its app, which is partly why it's so unified with other screen experiences that you see. If you're a Slack user, if you use the desktop app, if you use, I think, the mobile app, they are using web views. Matt Howie confirmed this last night for me. But again, the key word here, going back to what I just said, is consider using web views. Web views are not for everybody. It's up to your team to decide that. And I've talked to a few people for whom web views do not work well as far as performance and things like that. but I think there's an option to be considered here. And if someone like Amazon or Slack can use it, then it might be okay for your organization to use it as well. Unify content and actions, or maybe another way to say this, I've hammered on this already in my remarks, but maybe another way to put this is the way Josh Clark says it, sync verbs, not just nouns. So content across devices, but actions as well. So going back to Facebook, I got a little frustrated. Facebook actually does a terrific job in many areas of unifying the experience across all screens. But there are some small things that really bug me about the experience that I wish they would fix. This is one of them. So I wrote this the day before we celebrated the official anniversary of Authentic Jobs, just a couple weeks ago. I wrote this in bed at night. It says 8:47, but I'd started it much later than that. And I'm writing this from bed. I could not tag my own company. We have an Authentic Jobs page, of course, within Facebook, and I could not tag my company from the mobile app. I could do that with names down here, so I could tag Miles and Suzanne. I could tag people, but I couldn't tag companies. And I knew that I could tag companies back on the desktop. So heaven forbid I had to get out of bed, go to my laptop, and finish that post just so I could tag Authentic Jobs. And I thought that was silly. I mean, it's a small example, but this, for me, in this case, this was not the best interface. The best interface was not within reach. The best interface was sitting over on my desk on my laptop that I had to go get to finish this post. Small thing, right? But it sometimes makes a big difference. We talked about this, store session data in the cloud rather than locally. Anytime you can put things like shopping cart data in the cloud, please do it. Cookies, sessions, you know that those are specific to a single device. This happened just last week, and I told my team, this is perfect timing because I'm going to throw this in this presentation. We got an email from a customer that said this: "Hi, Authentic Jobs. I have a job listing in my cart. However, when my boss tried to pay for it, he can't see it." We're using the same login. So she was signed in. She had created the listing. She asked her boss to sign in on his computer to pay for it, and lo and behold, they couldn't do that. I did not know up until about a month ago, prior to this. I've been speaking about this for almost 2 years now. I did not realize that Authentic Jobs is not unified. I didn't know. I had assumed that you could have a listing in your cart signed in and go to any other screen and see that listing, and I didn't know that. And something came about that brought my eyes to it. And so when I saw this, I was like, well, this is perfect timing. But it, again, reinforced the pain for me where people are dealing with this kind of thing, and they're expecting it to just work one way, and it doesn't. Replace click with tap or press. This is a really small thing, but I found that when I do this when I'm talking to my team, and especially when I do this, when we do this, when we write copy, it makes a big difference. This finger pointer dates back to the 1980s. Maybe the first known use case of this was in hyperlinks for Apple's HyperCard. That goes back to 1998, but I've talked to a few people that say this goes back into maybe the late 80s, so this has been around for a long time. Still today, nearly 3 decades later, we describe the interaction with hyperlinks based on the sound that a mouse makes, that click, right? But for 3 decades at least, this metaphor and the appropriate description of acting and engaging with hyperlinks now in our time has been right under our noses. I think it's beautiful and appropriate that for all these years we've had a pointer finger representing how we interact with links. And I think we need to take that a bit more seriously in that we are really talking about taps now. To talk about clicks doesn't work. Here's an example of that. So if I get this email this is from WordPress, to reset my password on the desktop, it says, to reset your password, please click this button. That works fine until I pull that up on my mobile device and it says the same thing, right? Please click this button. Changing that to tap or press might be a bit more generic. Jimmy John's gets it, right? Point, tap, snap, not point, click, snap. Of course, you wouldn't do that with Instagram. Now, building on that, kind of in the same vein, I think we should also consider replacing mobile with small or mobile-ish and the like. Now, I've intentionally used the word mobile and desktop and tablet in this presentation because, like Kevin Spacey said, we're comfortable talking about those things, TV, and we in this room get that, right? But are we still making that same approach? Are we still siloing things as we work within our teams and maybe even with our users? no joke, whenever I can, and I do this pretty often, if I'm labeling things for my PSDs or my sketch files, or we have discussions in Slack and Basecamp, I actually use the names of the Jackson 5 to talk about different screen sizes. So if you look at my files, you'll see it says something like home01-Michael, and then you'll see cart dash Jermaine or something like that for the tablet size, because he's kind of in the middle. That is a reminder for me to think beyond these perfect sizes of mobile, tablet, and desktop. Brad Frost put together a great tool called Ish, where you pull this up, and in the upper left, you type in any domain you want, and then in the upper right, there are a few buttons you can tap, SML for small, medium, large. But the really cool thing about this is if you want to preview your design and say the small version of it, you tap that S and you get a design like this. You tap it again and you get a design like this, and so on and so forth. It's basically taking the rendering of your content and throwing at you different sized, smallish screens to remind you that it's not going to look perfect on this, whatever the dimensions are. Eliminate big screen bloat. I put this one in recently because I think this one's easy to forget too. I think we struggle with this as an industry. I think we still believe it's okay to trim things on mobile. I know I do. That if we go to mobile, we can then just start hiding things in a hamburger menu or even hiding things altogether. And yet we're reluctant to do the same thing when we go to the desktop. We know that now we have more users accessing our products, many of us do, on small screens before they get to big screens. Meaning a sizable portion of our audience might be working on a small screen more than they are a big screen. We've already hit that tipping point. I could show you lots of stats that show that. So it might be unacceptable to believe that bloated experience then on larger screens are acceptable. Luke W. just posted this 3 days ago. He overheard this conversation. You know, I'm screw this. I'm just going to go use the mobile version because it's so much easier. This is kind of like the reversal of our fridge metaphor, whereas users would first go to the soda machine of big screens and then go somewhere else expecting it to function that same way. They're now starting on small screens and transferring that to big screens. And so when they get to that big bloated experience, it becomes very frustrating. I encountered this just a couple days ago. My iMac had the white screen of death and reinstalling OS 10 and resetting the param, none of it worked. And so I had to create an appointment to take it in. On the desktop, it takes 7 taps to get a reservation at the Genius Bar. It takes 1 tap inside the app to do the same thing. It's unbelievable that we are okay with this kind of bloat on the desktop, and yet on the app, we can get there in just a flash. This is something I've said almost my entire career. It definitely applies here, but I think it applies to a lot of other things. And that is, you see me up here standing on stage, and I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. Hopefully I do. And you might take away from this thinking, well, Cameron said this, or Jeffrey said this, or Karen said this, and so that's exactly what I need to do. I'd like to encourage you to think, I was about to say to think for yourself. That sounds really bad. That's not what I want to say. But to recognize that you have the power and the knowledge to do exactly what you need to do. I think it was Jeremy Keith who's always said, forget stats. You know, back in the days when we were arguing, is it 800, is it 1024, is it 640? And we had all these stats that came out saying, oh, the majority of users are now on 1024 screens, and so now all of us can adopt bigger designs. And he's always made the argument, forget the stats, look at your own stats, look at your own data, and what does that tell you about whether or not your users have made that shift? And so this is just another reminder to do whatever works best for you. I might be sharing concepts to say do this and do that. You really need to go back to your team and figure out what works best for you. Here's an example of this. Facebook has bucked this notion of saying, well, if we were to follow Cameron's advice and say that things need to be unified, inclusive of the aesthetics, then they would have put the navigation bar across the top to mimic what you see in a larger screen. Lo and behold, they've done plenty of testing. They do their testing, I saw this article where they do their testing in 10 million user batches. How many of us have that kind of freedom to test 10 million people at a time in a single batch? And they found that for iOS users, There was far better engagement, satisfaction, revenue, speed, and so forth if they put that bar on the bottom. Probably in part because we're used to seeing on iOS, we're used to seeing that pinned to the bottom. This is a great example of saying, forget what the trends are and what the thought leaders are saying. We're going to go do what works best for us based on our statistics. And even on Android, they've bucked even what they did for iOS, where the bars are reversed. Now you have the top bar like you see on the larger screens, but this bar that's typically on the top is now down at the bottom. And finally, I think this is the last one, respect mental models. We've seen this, right? We saw this with the metaphor earlier. And if the best interface, is the one within reach, and hopefully by now I've maybe persuaded you to start believing that, if you haven't already, that will become true if and when all of us understand that we have the power to be able to design these things to be unified. And that if we go after responsive design in its truest sense of the word, we have the capability of creating wonderful, beautiful, unified experiences. And that is it. Thank you so much for having me.